It is. All right, very good. All right, so here we are. Remember last time our discussion was basically looking at the legal basis for planning. Um, this is probably one of the drier areas, but nevertheless a very important area of preservation because what it really shows is that although we have established case law, there's still going to be give and take. The legal system is not totally set in stone. It's meant to be flexible and to be able to come to grips with changing times, which is a good thing. So I have a video that's about 4 minutes long that talks about this issue, and I can show it at the beginning or at the end, but maybe what I'll do is show it at the end as a little bit of relief because it talks to the more dynamic nature of this whole thing. When you look at it in the textbook, it sounds like, well, this is all set in stone. It ain't necessarily so. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right, very good. Y'all have heard of designation of historic properties, where you say that, you can't do anything to this building because it's on the National Register of Historic Places. There's a lot of misinformation that goes into this. Fact of the matter is that being put on the National Register doesn't really offer that many protections unless you are trying to do work using federal money. Sometimes the state gets involved, but usually it's just for federal money. What it does try to do is build a sense of worth in the property and also many times a sense of its property value. So really is much more of a carrot than a stick, despite the reputation that it might have. Of course, many projects have a hard time saying they don't have any federal sponsorship because it usually involves highways, and highways are frequently mixed in with federal monies and so forth. So, but it's just not true that putting on the register is a protection for property or anything like that. It's basically based on its historic significance, which of course is something that's relative to the local community. Two factors, of course, the architectural value, which is the intrinsic value of the property. We talked about this the very first, couple of weeks of the course. And then the historical or cultural importance. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought somebody was saying they couldn't hear me. So, those are two main kinds of reasons for putting it on the National Register. Sometimes it can be both. And then, you basically try to talk about how significant this is. One of the things that really influences significance is how many other houses or buildings or places just like this are already on the register, of course. So let me see. Oh, there we go. It basically look at several criteria. Has it made a contribution to American history? And that can be not just specific events like, say, Gettysburg, but also, say, the industrialization of the country. So what you have is a very broadly applied item, but what it's trying to do is reinforce a sense of our history. And of course, this sometimes evolves. For example, right now, we're putting a lot of emphasis on African-American history, and this is plainly an area where we're trying to make up for lost ground. Also, women's history, for that matter. Trying to find ways to bring those stories forward and to make them more apparent. They've been left out of the history books. The property is associated with a significant person in the American past. Of course, that goes without saying. We look for the heroes in our life. The property embodies distinctive features that basically convey a sense of that significant time. Even though, you look at the individual features that may not be all that special, but you put it together and it makes for quite a nice composition. And then the property and its site yield or are likely to yield archaeological information. This is something that is somewhat problematic in that many places decide that it's better to do rescue archaeology. I think we mentioned that back in the early portion of the course, rather than doing full archaeological work. Certainly archaeology, even in Charleston, has kind of a bad rap for slowing down projects. And, to some extent, it speaks to, I think, our judgment as to what's important to try to save and what maybe we want to uncover that we never knew before. The General Services Administration, for example, tried to build a giant office building on what was one of the first graveyards in New York City. That caused quite a controversy for quite a long time because they found a lot of information in looking through that gravesite that told us something about the early founding of New York City, which we had no idea about. Of course, on the other hand, it also tended to disturb the African Americans in the local community who didn't like the idea that their people were being disturbed. So it's really kind of a knotty problem when you get right down to it. Maybe that's one reason why getting involved in archaeology sometimes is problematic, but it's an important part of our discovery of the past and knowing things that we never knew before. One of the things we're trying to do at the College of Charleston is getting archaeology in some of the backyards right now, starting at 12 Bull. And so this is an area that needs further exploration. It's amazing what's under the dirt, right? So National Register's criteria. And of course, when we start looking at how well it represents that particular time period, what we look for is the integrity of the structure as it relates to those things that it's being recognized for. And you've seen these before, right? Remember the way I organized it just to try to set it in my own mind was starting with the simple stuff first, which was the materials and workmanship, the items 4 and 5 here. Then moving on to the design and setting. Location is also placed in here. And then that really is because they want it to stay, they want the building or the place to stay where it is and not be moved. That was a frequent problem early on. And then feeling and association there at the end. One thing that's missing from this is land use, and I'm not quite sure. I think it varies from one place to the next as to how much they really look at how the adaptive reuse has been undermined the value of the property. But you know, these are very similar kinds of criteria as you see here. Feeling and association being a sense of the building, the vibe of the building, which I think is a reasonable way to put it. So you've seen this, you see a couple of changes here. If you look at it and think about it, you can see how it represents really about the same kind of thing as what we were talking about before. And then, you know, when we try to say, okay, now we know that it, you know, has integrity, we try to figure out if it is in fact significant. And what we're looking at here is in the textbook, he has a nice little thermometer, which is kind of an interesting way of putting it. But what we're looking at is the age of the structure. Of course, it has to be 50 years old. I should point out, though, that as we're looking at documenting historic vehicles, that age is not the criteria. We have documented, for example, the first smart car, even though they're not even on the road just yet, except in very specialized areas. That's just for buildings, 50 years. Good architectural style, good being a very, you know, sort of relative term, I suppose, but I think representative of the style as we've talked about it in this class and as it's commonly conceived. Whether or not it's been altered dramatically, of course, that takes away from its significance as well as its integrity. Whether or not it represents an interesting settlement or pattern of settlement that is different from other places. And original owner are all factors, and the original owner gets creeped in here. That's what we had originally, and the integrity as continuity. So you can see they kind of wrap into each other. So when you read these reports, these terms are not cut and dried. They get kind of mixed together, but you can see how it all kind of blends into a notion that is what is worth saving. And so as you look at it, a place like Charleston is going to have a lot, I want to say, higher level of criteria that something be, you know, considered historic than other places that maybe don't have quite so much history. And this is something that's, you know, dependent on the individual place. And this is part of the conversation that goes on as we try to decide what's worth saving. So what we're looking at is trying to figure out what's important. One of the big controversies going on right now is trying to, you know, designate modern buildings as historic. Mid-20th century buildings are now 50 years old. And people are starting to say, wait a minute, this is something worthwhile. Classic example of that is the, sort of ranch style and even split level style, although they're a little bit, younger, but especially the ranch style buildings. There are several neighborhoods in Atlanta, for example, that were designated as historic. We do not have a modern subdivision or a building type that's designated in Charleston at this point. There are several people, including a couple of people on the faculty, myself included, who are trying to get some neighborhoods put on the National Register. For example, South Windermere neighborhood, others over there, which represent considerable amount of cultural worth and value and are under a certain amount of threat at this point with tear downs and that sort of thing. And so we're trying to get it designated to try to get people to realize just how significant these buildings are and just how important it is to try to maintain some character there. Kind of a difficult thing. The city of Charleston, for all its emphasis on historic preservation downtown, is a whole lot less committed to it in the suburbs. So it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. This is part of a larger discussion that's going on. And so, and just as we talked about, these things are highly dependent on local areas. The historic context has a lot to do with it and how these things have evolved over time. In some cases, the evolution displays a meaningful representation of the cultural changes. In some cases, it's inappropriate. So these are all part of the considerations. And then as you look at it, generally speaking, if you're talking about a district, what we try to do is think about it in terms of the broader context, the historical context going on there. And they refer to that as thematic framework. Bear with me, this is only a couple more slides and then we'll be able to move on. And then we're basically, and I'll go through those particular thematic concepts here shortly, but it's part of sort of the ongoing narrative of US history that's being developed and actually being developed constantly. And so we try to designate historic sites to provide some kind of legal protection, mostly in terms of having to write a review. And what we're referring to in that last comment there is that we're looking at, the sites in Charleston. Going back to West Ashley, it's a big fight right now trying to get the city to actually do an inventory of historic properties, West Ashley, and they're putting their heels down because I think they're worried that it might slow down the progress of 526. So, oh yeah, even in Charleston, which is theoretically the home of preservation, there's this discussion always going on. As a direct result of which, we've lost several important sort of structures, culturally important structures to West Ashley. West Ashley used to be a farming area, and they've torn down the train station that used to basically allow all of the individual farmers to come in and distribute their food. We tore down the remnants of a German prisoner of war facility that was over there on the Ashley River that also speaks to a important time in the past of West Ashley. We've torn down and severely modified some old farmhouses. The thing that's different about West Ashley is that it was a farming community, not a plantation community. It kind of illustrates the other side of the coin of, this idea that we come from these giant plantations and that was the only thing that kept us going. No, quite frankly, there was a group of people who were more or less ordinary folks and were trying to carry on. It also has tremendous significance to the African-American community. One of the first townships, Black African-American townships that was established after the Civil War and actually, had its own mayor and everything else is over there in Maryville. And that's been systematically kind of obliterated from our history, and we're trying to do what we can to hang on to that. So this is something that is still part of the conversation. The thematic framework, which I alluded, let's just go through it quickly. Basically how changing demographics moved through areas. We all know that as we have major issues in our society that people tend to move. During the Great Depression, a lot of African Americans moved north. We do not know what changes this particular, tragedy and or problem is going to change our society as we are looking at new ways of thinking about, living in the face of these pandemics. Creating social institutions of movements, view the significance of these types of organizations. So in other words, we've got organizations that have been developed over time, whether it's the symphony orchestra or it's a particular park system or whatever that's important to individual communities, we may want to designate certain places there as important to them. I've been trying to get the carriage house over behind 97 Rutledge designated as a historic area because it was the beginning of the Charleston Symphony Orchestra. And that's where Maud Gibbon and others played the cello and learned and got the whole place started. She came in down here from New York back during the Charleston Renaissance. It's just a lowly little, carriage house, lots of charm. And it's just sitting in the backyard and nobody pays any attention to it. But it's kind of an interesting part of our history and one worth talking about, the Charleston Renaissance. Expressing cultural values, looks at sites where culturally significant events took place or are represented. Wow, there's a lot of overlap here, right? But you can kind of see how these terms kind of meld together. Shaping of the political landscape. Yep, place is important politically, then it tends to be considered important for the register. The American economy, of course, we're all about the economy and what it's meant to us. And so, that we talk about that. Henry Ford was really keen on that in his development of his various sites. Expanding science and technology, places of important scientific research. Yeah, we can call that. Transforming the environment, especially as it relates to transforming that and also preserving it. So places that are, sort of cultural landscapes that are based on a heavy emphasis on, the natural environment, but also involves people, or places that are just basically considered natural are still considered important for the National Register. We've talked about some of those early on. And the changing role of the United States in the world community as we have changed, particularly after World War II, or as we were settling. Those kinds of things are considered very important. Or international relationships, like the prisoner of war camps with the Japanese during World War II. So yeah, this is kind of a bit of a muddle. All you can do is kind of put these thoughts in your head. And what happens as you're writing your National Register nomination, they become part of, some are more important than others, but generally speaking, they get woven together into a narrative. These give you the terms of reference that helps you kind of build your case. And that's really what they're meant to do. Areas that are excluded from the National Register, as I said before, if they've been relocated, we don't tend to put churches if they're not terribly significant on the National Register. Unimportant buildings related to significant individuals, just because a person lived there, maybe they didn't do anything there, who knows. And then of course, we don't put statues on the National Register. So these are significant exclusions. And the process, I'll break this down a little bit easier. It starts by filling out your paperwork and sending it to the State Historic Preservation Office, the SHPO, SHPO that's there. And they basically, that's actually not terribly difficult. I've put several projects into the State Historic Preservation Office. And, I'm not saying it's not something you need to get done professionally, but nevertheless, it's not nearly so difficult as getting involved in the National Register, going through the state and communicating to the keeper of the National Register and trying to get it approved. There's a lot more documentation, historical information, and supplemental information that's required for that. Nevertheless, we've had over 80,000 individual buildings, towns, cultural landscapes, and structures nominated and put on the National Register. And of course, this is all being done on the auspices of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. So here we are. We're almost done. The highest sort of ranking is the National Historic Landmark, which is considered to have, national importance. And, places like Elvis Presley's Graceland Mansion would be considered nationally important and help, this is something that ties us together as a country. And so they become nationally important and considered landmark buildings. We have over 2,500 sites that are National Historic Landmarks. So one of the things also, as we're looking at trying to get on the Gullah Geechee corridor, the area around Kaw, which is just on the way to Savannah from Charleston, designated as a World Heritage Site. We're trying to get it first designated as a National Historic Landmark because of its historic and important cultural landscape there and all that happened there, of course. But usually they tie together into a whole network of concerns. There's also one thing, occasionally we have to take a property and say it's been changed so much or it's been obliterated that it gets de-designated. That's kind of a funny word. And so you see several examples of that over time. That does happen, but not all that often. So these are the review questions that are pretty straightforward. Some of them are kind of, whatever. This one is important, the Berman versus Parker study, case that basically allowed for aesthetics to be considered as part of an important sort of cultural thing. And we're not worried about how many stories we wanted to add to Grand Central Station. We need to be thinking about the case laws and what each one represented. Of course, in Gursky versus the Historic District Commission, it was all about demolition and whether or not a building, which was pretty straightforward, not terribly fancy, contributed to the overall and was indispensable in that respect. And understanding what the church, that we can get involved in churches is important. The Unity Temple, of course, was the first place that we really got involved in interiors, and it was something that was done voluntarily and put in conservation in perpetuity. And if a historic site goes undesignated, it can't be protected. Well, that's not true. If it could be, it can still be protected from federal monies. It's just a little bit more problematic, but you can still do it. If it would qualify, if we did the paperwork, then if somebody's willing to take it up, it can, the historic preservation ordinances can help to save places if people were to take it that far. So anyway, here I've been talking for about 20 minutes, and that's the maximum legal amount of time I can talk before everybody falls asleep altogether. What I'm going to do is go here. I'm going to, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Were you able to see those screens as I went through them?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. My communication on the screen says that it had been paused for some reason, and I'm kind of considering that. But now what I'm going to do is get to that video that I was wanting to show you and basically change screens if I can do that. Stop share there. Now I'm going back to this screen. This guy does a pretty good job of talking about the challenges that we all face. I think it's there. Yep. So it's much more than cut and dry, this idea of putting on the National Register and deciding on what's important. It's part of a dialogue which is going to be going on even more now as we think about our life after this epidemic. Let me see, I need to go back to sharing. Where is it? Okay, now share screen. And I'm going to go to this one. Okay, there we are. Sorry, I'm talking to myself. I find I listen a lot better sometimes. All right, here we go.
So weighing preservation questions against public safety issues like demolition, condition of structures in very distressed or depleted neighborhoods, there's no science to it. And I think this is really an emergent sort of area of interest for planners who may see preservationists intruding as a little bit of a nuisance, and preservationists who are really starting to relearn what preservation is, because we're moving from thou shalt not to maybe. That's a big philosophical leap. I mean, so we're making a big philosophical leap as practitioners from conserving everything to sort of being facilitators of change. So stewardship questions, which buildings should stay, which buildings should go. And I don't know if there's like a really great formula. As a practitioner who's worked in a lot of distressed areas in St. Louis and East St. Louis and other places, what I really see, we really have to get down to block by block microdynamics. And one of the things they say a lot is, looking at very small scale impact. Developers, planners, officials don't always like to hear the phrase block by block. Sometimes that's like an activist cry thrown up against bigger projects and more strategic planning. But really, when you're looking at which buildings to pull down, that's crucial, because you're looking at buildings that could be catalysts, corner buildings, or buildings that conserve a very intact block that are in the middle of the block. These might not be the best examples of an architectural style or the best and most historic buildings in a city, but they have an economic and cultural link to a broader plan or a broader possibility for a neighborhood. Those are the ones I think should be saved. The isolated buildings are often marginal, easily expendable by some measures, but those can get tricky too, because if you're looking at a neighborhood like Old North in St. Louis, parts of Kensington and Fishtown here in Philadelphia, you've seen people take one or two buildings and do amazingly creative, maybe not so traditional preservation activities by incorporating vacant lots and vacant land around the buildings into redevelopment. So it's tough. There is not a pat answer. It's really all about, I think, which buildings have the most chance, the biggest chance at economic recovery. That's something that you're not really trained as a preservationist necessarily to think about. It's also something a lot of planners aren't necessarily trained to think about, because we're not trained to think about making money necessarily off of real estate. And they're not always trained to think about a tiny building, one little 25-foot wide building in a big scheme. Sometimes it doesn't seem very important, but you take 3 or 4 out on a 2-block stretch, and all of a sudden you have holes that are going to lower property values and discourage investment. You know, it's really, I think, all about drilling down and looking at things one by one, block by block, being very careful, not to impede progress, but to try to bring progress to the table. But it's tough, and it's really not something mainstream preservation has been good at lately.
So anyway, the case made there. So what I've given you is sort of the textbook answer to why we designate properties and how we designate properties. But I've tried to infuse it with just the fact that this is part of the discussion. These are the terms of reference that we use. This is what's been done in the past. But as we move forward into the future, there's a whole lot of information. We become much more involved with planning and economic development planning. We're interested in, you know, making preservation an important part of the future, and so consequently we do need to adapt. So anyway, I'd like to kind of conclude today's class if anybody has any questions, and also to ask you one if you don't have any of me. How are we doing, guys?
Pretty good.
All right. I know that was not the most scintillating lecture in the world, but I'm trying to get the basic information out there. But do you take my point about how this has been established over time, but still is flexible, still is evolving? That's a takeaway, right? We good with that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I see you there, Brian. Are you good with that?
Yeah, I understand. Yep, I got it.
Okay, very good. I'm also wondering, I'll ask Kim since she's here. Kim, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Very good, thank you. So I would ask you, and you could ask your friends too, what do you think is going to change as we start thinking about preservation issues after this pandemic? Boy, that's a thought, right? How does disease relate to buildings? But, you know, let's talk about it.
I don't know where to start.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's like, wow. So just, you know, share, if you don't mind, a story or whatever, because that's what happens when we start thinking about what to preserve, what's important, what's meaningful to us. It starts with stories. It starts with our individual reflections, and we put it together as a people, right? Anyway, give it a shot. Give me just a story. Perhaps.
When I was a kid, I spent like quite some time in the hospital, and maybe we can start like looking at hospitals or something like that, because they're also public buildings, and some of them have they do have some like designs. That's
Right.
interesting. I'm not sure.
I like your idea of hospitals. I think that's very interesting. You know, certainly if it plays a role in this pandemic, and we don't know how it's going to play out at this point, that could be something that becomes part of an important milestone. Anybody else? That was a great idea, Kim. Anybody else?
I think it'll change a lot because I know a lot of places are losing funding. So I think that might change like the historic buildings that maybe like we see on a day-to-day basis in their funding to like preserve those places, because a lot of people aren't working. So they're not going to have people that come and like look at the buildings and whatnot. So that might change. I'm not really sure.
You're talking about staffing from the city or the Preservation Society standpoint?
Right.
So maybe some of the sort of measures that we use now to maintain buildings get loosened up a little bit?
Yeah, for sure,
Well,
I think.
yeah, that's an interesting idea. We already see that in the way the BAR, even though they don't like to admit it, enforce their rules in poor areas, for example, on the east side than they do, say, south of Broad. And a lot of it has to do with number of people who complain, right?
Yeah.
Make small changes south of Broad, everybody and their dog's going to know about it. And if the gate's not opening in the right direction or whatever, they're going to report you to the people and they're going to come out and talk to you. And the east side, they're just happy to have you there. And so even though some of it may be considered historic, they're willing to, accept exterior storm windows, for example, because they're a much more practical approach than, what the preservationists want you to do. I mean, in terms of money, right? So yeah, we may have to develop a more flexible approach to the way we conserve buildings, and maybe for the first time, and this is something the BAR has already started doing, considering cost. Because we're all in kind of a pickle right now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody else have any ideas? These are great ideas, guys.
Another thing I think is tourism.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that'll be affected, particularly in Charleston, because there's nobody here right now, and just that's going to affect local businesses and that sort of thing that are in historic property.
So you think people won't be traveling so much?
Yeah, at least for a few months.
Interesting. Well, it's going to change a lot of long-term thinking, I guess. I mean, it kind of depends on how long this thing goes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Tourism. So we've already decided to change the visitor center and try to redevelop it according to some new models of tourism. That building could very well get caught in the crossfire, of the changing times if tourism takes a big hit.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also maybe now all of a sudden, I don't know, we may not have so many students, we may not have so many tourists, and maybe the restaurant business kind of tapers off. I mean, most people don't remember when I first came to Charleston, which was in 1989, or no, I'm sorry, 77 I first came, that's right, 77 was the first year of Spoleto. And that year, there were only 3 restaurants downtown.
Yeah, because my mom grew up here, and I would always ask her, like, when you were little, where'd you eat? And she's like, we didn't eat anywhere because there were no restaurants.
Yeah. There was the Greek place on King Street, which is still there, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Used to go there from time to time, especially after city council meetings, because the members all came up, went upstairs and got drunk after the meeting. So it was kind of pleasant watching them stumble down the steps afterwards. Anybody else want to contribute to the conversation? Anybody else, feeling anything about what changes are going to be wrought by this current situation?
Well, kind of going off what Gabe was saying with the whole tourism, definitely going to affect the restaurants. And yeah, it's just gonna be a whole change with kind of opening up space more in Charleston than anywhere else, really, because there's just going to be so many restaurants being shut down.
Yeah, in another area, you guys wouldn't probably come to grips with it, but in my particular case, I have, I'm separated from my wife, but she's in a nursing home up in Philadelphia. And now that nursing home is suffering with a lot of issues. They've had a couple of deaths. Several people have gotten sick on her wing, and now she's got a fever and they're worried about her. So I'm thinking, we may have to think about how we deal with the infirm and the older people who, instead of, putting them all in the same building and saying, here, we'll put you here, we have to spread them out in society a little bit more. That's another more general reflection.
Because at this point, it's been spreading, so.
Yeah, no, I mean, when you put vulnerable people all together in one place, it can be terrible, So anyway, that's just my reflection based on what's been going on in my life the past week or so. Well, anyway, it's interesting how this will develop, and it certainly will test our ability to kind of adapt. And who knows how it's going to develop. But, you know, let's keep our eyes peeled. You know, one of the things that's going to make a big difference is how we choose to go back to work, right? And how we phase that. Not quite sure. I haven't really thought it through well enough, but people are starting to actually think about that. And China, of course, is dealing with it right now. In Wuhan, I think I'm saying that right, where they're finally letting people out under sort of controlled circumstance. And I kind of wonder, you know, what lessons are to be learned and whether or not we will be proactive and look there before we just, you know, say, okay, business as usual, and find out that it can't work that way. So it'll be interesting. Anyway, guys, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. If there are any questions, please call me. I was pleased to see that most of you managed to get your historical reports in, and I'll be having a look at them shortly. I had meant to do that last night, but I just, you know, passed out from sleep, you know, about 8:30 or so. So anyway, I will get to them shortly. For Friday, what I'll do is I'll try to record another lecture because I need to stay on this, but it will be available for you to look at if you can't make it on Friday. Is that okay?
Sounds good.
Yes.
All right. Well, anyway, if you have anything else, let me know. If you need to talk after class, just stay on and we'll talk. I'll go ahead and stop the recording at this point.